Welcome everyone to lecture 7 of the East Bay DSA Capital class here at the East Bay Democratic Socialists of America Center in Oakland. And thanks everyone for joining me on a Friday evening. It was the only time that worked for me and Molly and the office, but it's maybe not the most optimal time, but hopefully people have some plans after or having a chill night after. But yeah, welcome to lecture 7. I know here we've had some groups consolidate, but I think we're still at 4 or 5 groups going relatively strong. And most have passed through chapter 21, Simple Reproduction, which is what we're going to be covering today. Some are already into chapter 23, so they're ahead, and my group's a little behind, but we are nearing the end. After this one, there's only going to be one more lecture on volume 1, and then one lecture on volume 2 and 3 and summing up. That's not directly tied to any part of the book. So, and then I wanted to just start again with this image of the onion and sort of building on the concepts in Marx, because actually that's a lot of what we're going to be doing in this lecture, I think, is sort of building new layers on top of old concepts. And in particular, this sort of image and the difference between the value of labor power or necessary labor and surplus value or surplus labor. We're going to just sort of be attacking that, I guess, from 2 or 3 different angles along with Marx. So just to maybe go over it so that we're all in the same sort of headspace, right? This is the difference between the amount of time it takes to produce the means of subsistence, to reproduce workers ourselves day by day, and how much additional time beyond this necessary amount, right, that those same workers actually spend working. So even if everything you consume in a week only takes, 20 hours of social labor time, you work 40 or 50 or 60. And it's that gap that sort of defines surplus value. Okay. So with that, I see maybe 2 more people coming in. Thanks. But I'm going to just jump into it. Starting with part 5. And we're getting to these 2 parts where there's so many small chapters that I'm just going to tackle them as parts. Part 5, part 6, the production of absolute and relative surplus value, and then wages. And so we're going to be covering chapters 14 through 16. And I wanted to start this discussion of part 5, excuse me, by maybe doing a little bit of joke, just being a little funny, because Marx starts with the question of what productivity is under capitalism. And I'll say like the classic way of discussing it is maybe, oh, productivity is related only to surplus value. But I think there's also like a cultural argument in there, right? About what counts as productive today. And anyone who is online or involved with this stuff or, variety of different things knows that there's all sorts of things about being productive today, from monitoring and managing your own health, reading all sorts of self-help books about, how to be a better person, how to be a better worker, how to get more done, how to get more rich, all sorts of actual and then made fun of videos about morning routines that make you more productive, etc. Even sort of this idea of self-care, right? That's so focused on making you ready and calm to behave your best the next day, or the more masculine version of just plunging into incredibly cold water. All these various things, sort of everyone wants their side hustle, everyone wants their thing to be monetized, right? All of this you could see as sort of a cultural takeover of an idea of what is good and what is productive by a sort of capitalist sort of idea that it has to be making money, has to be moving forward, has to be making surplus value. And so what doesn't count? Well, sitting on the couch, eating a nice bowl of ice cream, watching the TV, that doesn't count as productive. However much you enjoy it, however great the TV show is, however great the ice cream is, that's a height of culture right there. But jokes aside, this little image from Sopranos, right? This idea of a certain type of relaxation that is wasteful and that we understand as sort of bad and wasteful because it's not necessary to get us ready to work the next day and make more money for other people and move the world forward, right? It's just us using free time for ourselves and our own enjoyment. not for other people's money. And so that's sort of the crassest version, but of course, to be a little more serious, right? This also comes down to things like teachers and people who work in the public sector not being seen as productive in the same way, and maybe, in teachers' case, not getting paid very well, having to live, paycheck to paycheck, um, having, to struggle, even though you're doing a job that I think most people would agree on some level is maybe the most or one of the most socially important ones, but it's not considered productive. And similarly, this is a little bit of a funny angle, but if you've seen someone who, makes their money or at least their spare money by collecting recyclables on the street, right? This is actually, in a sense, right? If we just turn off some of our own thoughts about it, totally productive work. They're producing aluminum. Who could be more productive? But no, it's not seen that way because again, right? No one is making a profit off of these people. They're in a sense a sort of urban forager or something like that, right? So all sorts of things don't count as productive, even though they achieve social ends. And Marx is sort of making that point, right? That now that we've gotten to this point in the book, we can say that in capitalism, what counts as productive has to actually make, money, money for people. So just to sum up, that is sort of the reframe of productivity that we get in this section. And then I just wanted to go into the actual terms themselves, relative versus absolute surplus value, and distinguish the two and talk through them. And I'll say, starting now or whenever, feel free to break in with questions or raise a hand, come grab the mic. We can do sort of a question session. And I hope today will be not too long, so there should be plenty of room for that. But basically, Marx is distinguishing and has distinguished between two processes of producing surplus value in capitalism. And one, the process of producing relative surplus value, is about increasing productivity and thus lowering the necessary labor in the workday. And the other, the process of producing absolute surplus value, is all the capitalist's efforts to fit more labor time into each day, whether that's intensifying it or extending the literal hours of the day. And so we're basically going to just go through these two as a combined and total sort of the production of surplus value. And to start, we'll start with Marx, right? With absolute surplus value. What needs to exist for there to be absolute surplus value? And I'm going to do a good chunk of review in this lecture. I think Marx is doing a good chunk of review in this section. But we really do have to go back to basics to answer this question, right? To begin with, there needs to be a commodity market. There needs to be a way for the person who's producing, the capitalist, to sell what they produce for value on the market. And there needs to be a way for the workers, the people, to meet their needs by buying goods on the market, right? So we need a market of commodity exchange and value. But more than that, if we're talking about absolute surplus value, we need a labor market, right? We need a specifically divided sort of class structure within the commodity market, in which on the one hand, there's these independent commodity producing capitalist firms, and they are buying labor power from wage workers, proletarians, dispossessed workers. And so this separation of the worker from the means of production, where the vast wealth of society is not held by people, it's held by Apple and Johnson & Johnson and Chevron and Stellantis. That's what also sort of leads to the workers selling their labor power on the market as a commodity. And so that's the sort of second condition. And then there's really only one other condition for absolute surplus value, which is the most obvious one, which is the extension of the working day. So once you have a commodity market to sell your goods, once you have a labor market to buy labor power, wage labor as a process, and then once you're pushing that workday beyond the necessary amount, you have achieved absolute surplus value as a capitalist. And so that gets us sort of to this, historically, if we're thinking this sort of image of a lot of people doing work pretty similar to what was done pre-capitalism, right? Artisanal type work, but crammed into a building instead of them owning the machines, the capitalist has bought the machines, the capitalist is paying the rent, and they're making them work 10, 11, 12, 13 hours a day. So they're getting that absolute surplus value. But at a certain point, as we've mentioned a couple times in the book, the length of that workday does have real limits, right? You cannot extend it into 18, 20 hours. You end up having workers who are literally dying, are being murdered by the extension of the workday. There's a real limit to how far it can go. And so the capitalist sort of has to turn, right, to this alternative process. If I can't push the workday farther, how do I get surplus value? Well, I can reduce the necessary labor part. And that is sort of how Marx frames it at first, this sort of historical progression. First, you push the workday as far as you can. Now you're trying to reduce the necessary part. And what do you do then? Well, what needs to exist for there to be relative surplus value? And this, again, a little bit of review, but it's just, again, thinking of all the different commodities we use every day, from the food, the medicines, the basic products, health products, now the computer and car, the clothes, the building, and think of all that basket of goods as our necessary goods, our necessary labor. So the necessary labor is the value of labor power, which is the value of those means of subsistence. And really the question we're asking here, when we ask how do we make relative surplus value, is how many socially necessary labor hours go into the means of subsistence that we all consume? And how do we go about reducing those hours? How does the capitalist go about reducing those hours? And so that's sort of the problem. And this one has, in a sense, a simpler answer. I could go through manufacturing and machinery, but really it's just revolutionizing the labor process itself, right? It's the grand historical trajectory of the last 200 years that has totally transformed how all sorts of different types of work are done, including, in this picture, sort of the dramatization of the seizure of the atom itself by the worker. Thanks to Diego Rivera for this beautiful mural. And so that is basically the process of relative surplus value. And I did want to give a little bit of a sense of this in our modern day, and just share a video that we watched in my group and people found useful, of like, what does it look like to really have this totally revolutionized labor process right now in the modern world? And we thought a good example was the Amazon warehouse. So
before it reaches your door, every item goes through a labyrinth of conveyor belts and are handled by both humans and advanced robotics.
So we have two big phases. The first phase is called inbound. A trailer comes, we unload the trailer. We would transfer whatever is in the trailer into small totes. You will see them around the building. There are yellow totes that can store up to 30 inch. And then it's going to a stower. The stower is going to grab an item and put an item into a shelf. And the shelf is being moved by a robot. If you click, I'm going to buy this one, then as soon as you click, we will start the process called outbound. 10 years ago in an Amazon fulfillment center, you would have to walk to grab an item from a shelf. Right now we have drives that would come to you with the shelf. So you don't have to walk, the shelf is coming to you. You're going to pick this item into a tote. The tote is going to go from the third floor to packing area, which is here in the ground floor. So we have two types of packing. One is what we call single shipment, where we would pack one item into one box. And the other one is multi-shipment. And then it's going to the Amazon robotic sortation platform. And it's going to go into the sort points, which is a zip code. And then the zip code will go to a trailer, and then the trailer will go to a delivery station downstream to go to a customer.
So just thinking about, the way that our own, in this case, one of the more modern things that's been revolutionized in this way, the last mile shipping industry has been truly taken over by large scale industry in a way similar to some of the things we saw before. But that is the production of real surplus value, right? It's reducing the cost of getting all these industrially produced goods to us in this crazy way, by mechanizing away a lot of labor, increasing productivity. And so what's the broad narrative here? From formal subsumption to real subsumption. These are two terms that just come up a couple times in the chapter, but I did want to highlight them because there's a lot of Marxist writing about them if you're the type of nerd who reads Marxist writing. But basically, Marx is saying, right, that there's sort of two stages to the way capital takes over the world and the labor process. And the first is just putting it under its basic rules, right? So wage labor, extension of the workday. Now you are formally a part of capitalism. But capital hasn't transformed the very way you're doing things, hasn't transformed how you think about your work, how you relate to your work, right? These are still, in a sense, artisans. They think of their relationship to work in a similar way they did before. They feel horrible about the sort of brutal extension of the workday that's occurring. Well, go, 100 years in the future, and we have sort of a modern car factory here. This is really subsumed work. The entire labor process has been totally transformed in the image of capital. In fact, the worker enters the factory, which might be the size of, 10 football fields, and feels completely dwarfed by the process, which they don't themselves understand, and which ends up giving them a different relationship to their own work, different sense of what's happening. And basically, if you want to get more into this, you can relook at, I think, that chapter 13 on machinery. But this is sort of the historical narrative here. And I just want to highlight that although this is right, this sort of historical development from absolute surplus value and formal subsumption to relative surplus value and real subsumption, there's also an argument to be made that you shouldn't see these historically, that they're both always happening. And Marx makes sort of both of these arguments. So he's not going to say either one is right or wrong, but he's saying they're sort of both there and we should see both of them. So in a sense, even today, right, we've covered this before, there's always a push for absolute surplus value. There's always a push to work longer, to be working harder, to be working more, to be getting multiple jobs. That's what a lot of these are about. To be working as an Uber driver for 12 hours a day with a 2-hour break in the middle where you take a quick nap, etc. There's all this push to extend the workday in various ways. And so in a sense, absolute surplus value is totally well and alive today. It's a process that's still operating today. And in the same way, this is a little more metaphorical, but there's always a push to technologically advance under capitalism, right? When we talked about relative surplus value, we actually noted that it's not something that just goes to every capitalist evenly, right? It's the capitalist who is most advanced, who's getting those really big profits. Even if you have a modern factory, to use a little air quotes there, modern, if it's 50 years old, you're going to be maybe losing money producing because you're so much behind your competitors, right? So relative surplus value is not something that you've just achieved. It's actually a continuous slope, right? The capital is always clawing its way up. It's a drive, it's a process to always keep reducing that necessary labor time and increasing the time that's available for capital. And so in that sense, relative surplus value is also a process that's always occurring, even from the beginning. And I just wanted to highlight both of those. And now we are going to get into a bit of a more boring part where we actually sort of go through some of the examples. But does anyone have any questions on absolute or relative surplus value? Sorry, 1 second there.
Just yell. It's a small issue. When you were mentioning the intensification of the work process as being part of the surplus value, I think you called it part of absolute surplus value, because I had thought that it was a part of the relative, that it was that it didn't have to do with time, it had to do with doing something else other than extending the day.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's maybe a little bit of a gray area in the sense that, like, just to talk through the example a little bit, when we looked at that Amazon warehouse, right? Part of the reason work is so intense is because of the technological development, the use of monitoring, the use of all these things. That is, in a sense, right? It's a technological development. And so it fits more in the relative side. But I also think some basic forms of just intensification of the workday, and we'll actually see that a little bit right here, really are pretty much the same as extending the workday, right? If you're forcing people to work through the sweat, completely focused, super intense for 8 hours, it's not really in any way different than them working 12 hours, but at a much slower pace. And so I personally find that it does tend to fit better in the absolute surplus value category. And I think back in one of those slides, I won't go to it, but I'll just say, I noted that it's good to think of absolute surplus value as trying to fit as much labor time into the workday as possible. Not just extend it, that's one part, but also fit more in the same sort of bucket of hours. And I think all of that you could say is this sort of tendency of absolute, more work from the same person in the same day. But I agree with you that I don't think it's like a totally cut and dry issue. Okay, unless there's any other burning questions, I'll jump forward, but feel free to raise hands throughout. So what else can we do with these concepts? I just wanted to go through some examples, and really the examples that Marx uses in the book. And starting with some assumptions. And here, I'll just note, I am deviating a little bit from Marx, just because, you know, I think it's helpful because it helps us think a little more about inflation and how inflation works, but it is slightly different assumptions than Marx, but pretty similar. But assumption number one, in the next 5 or 6 slides, we're going to assume there is no inflation. So the basket of goods, the means of subsistence is always the same money price. It's always $100 per day. That's what I sort of framed it as. And then secondly, we're going to assume, like Marx does all the way basically through the book, that a commodity is bought and sold at its value. In this case, labor power is bought and sold at its value, which means that the price of labor power is equal to the price of the means of subsistence, which is that same $100. So we're just going to make that assumption to help us see through these various examples, and I'll go through that a little more as we move on. But starting with productivity increase, what is going on here? Well, if we have productivity changing, but the magnitude and intensity of the workday constant, that means the number of hours in the workday is not changing, right? The number of value, the value or social labor hours is constant. And we're going to just start with that being evenly divided between necessary and surplus labor here. So $100 of necessary labor. Remember, we presumed it's always $100, at least in a base amount, and $100 or 4 hours of surplus labor. With a 2 times productivity increase, and that would be across society, right? Because just to remind you, we're imagining that productivity increase decreases the amount of value in the means of subsistence. So it's not just you are more productive, but everyone across society, people making clothes, making houses, making cars, have all become more productive. That, in that case, the total labor time still remains 8 hours, and the value in the whole day remains constant, right? We're not increasing the workday. We're not increasing the intensity of the workday, but we are leaving more room for surplus labor. That said, given our assumption of no inflation and labor power trading at its value, you can see that the 2 hours of necessary labor are still $100 here. And so the surplus labor has actually increased quite a bit, up to 300. And there's even some room here for workers to make demands for higher wages, with capital still getting a bunch of extra money in the end, right? So Marx even notes this. In the advance of productivity, there's some room for workers to make demands for higher wages. Okay. And I just want to note really quickly, because Marx mentions this, the causality here, right, is that productivity increases, thus necessary labor falls, thus there's more room for surplus labor, right? You can't increase surplus labor without necessary labor falling if the workday is constant. So it sort of has to flow that way. Productivity changes, necessary labor decreases, more surplus value. Now let's look at the alternative case, which is the magnitude or the intensity of the workday changing with productivity constant. And so given that there's no productivity change, the base necessary labor is set at a constant amount of 4 hours. 4 hours is always what you need for the necessary labor. and that's always $100. There's been no productivity change here. If, though, you have a 1.5 times increase in either the magnitude, so that would actually stretch it out to 12 hours, or the intensity of the workday, which would add sort of more social time in each hour, making it also equivalent of 12 hours, each day is now going to create more socially necessary labor time. So sorry, I went about that in a little bit of a convoluted way, but just to say it again clearly, whether you actually increase the number of hours or you increase the intensity, from society's perspective, in terms of socially necessary labor time, you've changed it from 8 to 12 hours, right? A more intense day counts as the equivalent of more time. And so in either case, you've achieved the same result. But as Marx goes on to note, this extension of the workday, this more work that's coming out of workers, also means that workers need to be paid more. To say it in one form, right? Because more energy and time is taken from people, there has to be more money for them to recover it, more means of subsistence. Another way of thinking about it that's maybe just more intuitive, right, is people who are working 12 hours a day are Uber Eatsing all their food, right? They're doing all sorts of things that cost more money. In order to wind down, they might need a more intensification, et cetera. So there's a way that, I would just say one more example, right, is let's say you get a second job. You're working more hours, you're also getting paid more, right? So that is actually reasonable because you're working so much more, it's taking so much more out of you that you deserve more pay. But even as that necessary labor increases, more hours are devoted to surplus labor. Here you can see the capitalist is getting $150 at the end of the day. And there's this sort of question of how much wage increase you actually get. Because if everyone starts working 12 hours, maybe they'll start pushing it down, pushing it down. And so these are the two sort of basic formulas for what happens when we're talking about, in fact, relative and here absolute surplus value. There's these sort of changes to the workday. And now I just want to sort of put them together, looking at the factory development and the factory acts, which is what Marx also examines. But I will say, I do think this type of example of increasing productivity, higher regulation of labor, more intensity is something that you see at a couple times in history. This is not a law. It's a historical, sort of specific historical development. And we're going to talk about it here in relationship to the 1870s and the factories. So just to start, we start with the base case. Now we're saying 12-hour workday, half necessary, half surplus. First, the factories come around. Suddenly, all the different things that are needed, the clothes, the food, agriculture is also industrialized, right? All these various things cost less. Productivity goes up across society. And the necessary part of that workday goes down to just 3 hours. But again, as you see, the dollar amount is still $100, and now the surplus has become $300 or 9 hours of labor. After the Factory Act comes into place, there's all this productivity. There's also the social regulation of the factories, right? The introduction of the Factory Acts, pull it down to 10 hours, pull it down to 9 hours, have more regulations. So the workday is actually shortened. And that is something that happens somewhat often. But capital will respond to that shortening by intensifying the workday. So then in that third step, now that you're only working 8 hours, let's turn up the speed of the machines. Let's make the assembly line go faster. And you may even get paid as a worker a little more, $133 now, but that is sort of your just desserts in a sense, right, for a more intense workday. And still the capitalist at the end of the day has significantly increased the amount of surplus labor and the amount of money value that they've made. And so that's just sort of going through an example of how these concepts can be useful to think through what's going on socially as productivity increases and workdays are shortened and lengthened, et cetera. And I just want to note, he also mentions here socialism, which, whenever Marx mentions socialism, I'm like, ooh, interesting. Let's see what he has to say. Is there a blueprint in there? What's going on? But I'll read this quote just so, read along with me. But basically, he says that what happens potentially under socialism? Well, only if the capitalist mode of production were abolished would it be possible to limit the workday to the part when necessary labor is performed. But even then, that part would be enlarged. For the worker would enjoy better life circumstances, and so he would expect more from life than the minimum it takes to maintain him. Moreover, a portion of what is now surplus labor would function as necessary labor, since some labor would be needed to bring about social reserve and accumulation fund. Just to clarify in modern terms, right? We would still want social security, social insurance in case disaster happens, and we would also still want some money to recreate our social world, right? To build new factories that make new things that we actually want, rather than things maybe we don't want, like missiles or, so we need still some reserve funds for these things. And then ending that quote, the absolute limit for shortening the workday is how universal labor can become capitalist free time by turning the whole lives of most people into labor time. And so there is this idea that, given these concepts, what can we say about a world that we could live in? Well, we actually could live in a world where, one, we have better life, right? That necessary labor is extended and maybe is 5 hours, but that's all the time that we work. And we actually have a bunch of free time that we can also devote to various different things. Just to sort of bring in an image, right? This has always been a part of socialism, is this idea of free time. This is a drawing from a postcard from the Soviet Union titled "A Day Off." But there was often a lot of these images about time off and how you would spend time off and the beautiful gardens you would be in and the beach and the resorts. And so there is this sense of the joy of free time for everyday working people. And then I wanted to end with this sort of thorny issue, which I'm sure if any of you are in these groups, you've run into this conversation and been like, what is going on here? But Marx spends a whole little chapter basically differentiating between two ways of expressing the rate of surplus value. He says, I like this one if we put surplus value over variable capital, or surplus value over labor powers value, or surplus value over necessary labor. So that's the green over the brown in all those bars we've been looking at, right? But he doesn't like this idea of putting surplus labor over the whole workday, or surplus labor over the whole product's value, or the total product. And just to clarify here, right, we're talking about the product of the day of labor, not the other constant capital and the raw materials and that sort of stuff. Why is Marx making this difference, and why is he emphasizing it? That's sort of, I think, a question. And I'm going to just argue that there is something here that I think is interesting to think through and work through, which is it sort of goes back to some of the arguments we were making. This is a slide way back from lecture 2, if people remember, around fetishism. It's about how we see the world and the basic premises upon which we see the economic life that we live. And so in this case, if you remember, I was noting this difference where, normal economists and most, intellectuals of the day think of the relationships of capitalism as natural relations. Basically, the market is natural, the way people relate is natural. And so how do you respond to social problems? Well, an expert writes a book about how scientifically to relate to the natural relations of society so that nations don't fail or poverty can be reduced or, all these various things. Marx is taking a very different view on society and its problems, right? He's saying that society and the relations underlying capitalism are actually historical, they're changing, and they're filled with conflict, with class conflict. And so if you want to solve a problem, you're not going to tinker with it in a sort of form of expertise. You're going to organize the lower classes and you're going to create the red wedge to break open the white circle, right? So it's sort of a difference of fundamental framing. And I think the way he's thinking about these 2 points here is actually similar. So I just want to use that to sort of frame it. So again, this difference between, one way of presenting the rate of surplus value and other is that in one way, when you have sort of surplus value over the workday, really what you're doing is you're saying, as a society, we all come together, we all form one big association, and we produce a common product, the product of the workday. And now we have to come to some deal. How much do you get? How much do you get? Does the worker get 100%? No, well, that's not reasonable. Now, is it? Capital contributed something, they should get something. The landlord provided the land, they should get something, right? It sort of frames society as this associational relationship You've produced something together in association, and now there's this question of compromise and coming to a deal over who gets what part, the distribution of the total product. And Marx is going to basically say it's not really the right way to think about these things. And instead, the way that he's framing it, the surplus value over labor power's value, surplus value over necessary labor, is saying that at the heart of this social process, workers are being forced to work longer than is necessary. There's a necessary amount of work to actually meet the needs that they have in the way that they live, and they're being forced to work twice, 3, 4 times as long as that because they're dispossessed from the means of production, because they're facing capital, who owns all the various things they need to work. And then they come home from their work living paycheck to paycheck, right? So next week, they have to go back to work. They don't have anything saved up. They can't just sort of sit along on the side. And so now we're seeing sort of a process of class relations between two classes, a process of exploitation in which workers are actually forced to work longer than they need to meet their own needs in order that others cannot work or can lead, can, rule society. And so it's this sort of framing that I'll just say I think Marx is getting at with this distinction, which otherwise I'll admit appears a little pedantic, but hopefully this helps you think of it in a different way. Okay. And with that, yeah, you can take a question. Do you want to, yeah, if you could re-ask just because we're recording it. No, all good.
I think I missed it earlier. What was variable capital?
It's all good. I don't think I covered it in this lecture, so it's from a past lecture, but variable capital is basically the part of capital when the capitalists advance it that goes to paying the workers' wages. And he calls it variable precisely because that's the part that, you pay the workers' wages, which is the means of subsistence, but then they actually work and they work longer. It's that sort of thing we covered at the beginning. And so in a sense, it varies over time. But it's the part of capital that goes to pay the workers. Okay. Any other quick questions before we move on to wages? Okay, the next 2 sections are a little shorter. I just spent some extra time on that one. So wages. I wanted to just start with saying that finally we've gotten to wages. I don't know. I think there's been a number of people who say that, Marx doesn't write that much about wages. In fact, there's some secret plan that he had for a whole nother book just on wages, all sorts of things about this. But clearly, wages is just one of the more universal experiences of our time, right? It's, in a sense, the basic experience of being a working class person in some form, is that you go to work, you get paid for that work, you get paid a wage of some form, and then you use that to buy all the things you need. And it does seem, as we go through that experience, I'll even say as I go through that experience, right? The intuitive feeling of it is that you get paid for the work you're doing. You get paid for your labor. You don't think, oh, I'm getting paid the means of subsistence value, right? It just doesn't quite seem that way. So it's this intuitive sense that we get paid for the work we do, and then we go and buy the various things we need. And in this section, Marx is basically, on the one hand, going to challenge that intuitive sense and say, well, actually, it is you getting paid for the means of subsistence. But on the other hand, note that, of course, that's how you feel. In fact, that's how this system was set up to make you feel. That's part of what the whole framework is. And so just as a quick explanation of sort of the contradiction here that we're getting at, if we are selling our labor, the whole system stops making sense, right? And this is actually a review of chapter 4, if anyone wants to go back and look through it. But right, he talks about, well, how do you have growth of capital when you also have everything being exchanged at its right value? And now we can restate it here with labor, right? So either labor is sold at its value, and thus there's no surplus labor, right? You get paid the value of your labor, you get paid for every hour. But if there's no surplus value, the whole underlying reason that the capitalist has hired you or anyone, profit, is gone, and thus no worker is even hired in the first place. So we've hit a dead end there. Obviously, that's not what's going on. Well, let's look at the other side. Or labor is sold below its value. Then the economy is all based fundamentally on a sort of cheating a cheating when you buy and sell different things, right? When I buy labor, I'm doing really good and I'm cheating the worker, I'm paying them less than they deserve. The very law of value, that things are exchanged for what they're worth, is at its core false. And the sort of commodity system and the logic we've set up doesn't really make sense anymore. And so that also, I think, isn't right. And we're going to maybe go into that a little more here. But basically, Marx is saying you can't think of it this way. And if you're rigorous about how you're thinking, you realize we are not selling our labor. From a more philosophical point of view, if you remember back to lecture 2, value is socially necessary labor time. And this is, again, a very brief review. Apologies for people who missed this lecture, but right, we said the content of value is this sort of homogeneous, socially necessary labor time. The form of value is all the exchangeability between all the different commodities that ultimately gets expressed in money, right? And so both the content and the form of value are actually labor time. And thus labor cannot have value. It is value. It's a measure of value. And in the same way that, of course, you could say 1 meter is 1 meter in length. It's actually nonsense to say something like that, right? A meter is a measure, and you don't get a measure of a measure. You just use a measure. It doesn't really make sense to measure a measure. And so that, in 2 different ways, is sort of thinking about the difference between labor power and labor. And I hope that's enough. We will maybe come back to it once more in this section, but I hope enough to convince you that we do have a right to say, actually, workers come and they sell their labor power on the market for a specific value. And that's a different value than the actual hours they end up working. Why does that happen? How do workers come to sell this thing? Well, here, Marx basically does, again, a little bit of a review, but there's basically 2 historical conditions, you could say, well, one main one, but I'm going to put 2, that create this condition. And the first is dispossession. So I wanted to read this quote from earlier in the book that I really liked when I read it, and so I stuck it right on a slide and bring it back. But saying labor capacity or labor power isn't the same as saying labor. These are 2 different things. Any more than saying the capacity for digestion is the same as saying digestion. Digestion, as we know, requires more than a strong stomach. It needs food. And so I just want to point out that Marx is, from the beginning, right, seeing, obviously, in your mind, theoretically, you could say, of course, everyone has labor power. Of course, everyone has labor capacity. But when does it become important to actually clarify labor capacity and labor power as something distinct, something different? Something that's sold and bought as a commodity? Well, only when people are dispossessed and they're unable to actually labor. They don't have the means of production, right? They don't have the tools. They don't have the machines. They don't have the wealth to just start working on their own. They also don't have the food to start living and just figuring out what they're going to do. They don't have the money to buy the food, to pay their rent. So all they have is something to sell, and all that they have to sell is a capacity. It's not actual labor itself. And so it's fundamentally a dispossession that creates this need to sell labor as a capacity, or to sell your labor capacity. Oh, sorry, that went faster. And then second, once we've sort of agreed that this sort of labor capacity is created by dispossession, it actually has to be sold as a commodity on the market, right? Which is what happens all the time in all of our lives, I presume, or certainly people we know's lives, right? You work, you sell yourself on the labor market to some sort of capitalist firm or some other appendage of modern society, the state, et cetera. And so basically, first the worker is dispossessed, and then they sell their labor power as a commodity on the market. They're not selling their labor. And that leads us to this question of what the value of that labor power is. And like anything else, Marx basically says it's the amount of labor required to produce it. Again, this is a little bit of review, but if you remember this slide from a handful of lectures back, right? Labor power is sort of unique or weird because it's not something you produce through work. I am not making my neighbor, I'm not building another human being. There is no way to produce labor capacity like you produce a shirt. But it is something that is reproduced in our social life in social reproduction, right? If people are familiar with that term, by consuming a bunch of means of subsistence, whether that's your rent, the food, your bed, all sorts of other things, cultural products. And so various wants and needs of the worker determine the means of subsistence, which themselves are commodities generally and do have value on the market. And that is the value of labor power, right? So you get paid enough to buy the things you need to reproduce yourself. But that does leave some flexibility. It's not as clear cut as the value a commodity has, right? Maybe workers say their needs are more. Does their claim right? Maybe capital concedes. There's a play of force here. And so I just wanted to sort of note that as this basis. And that still leaves this difference that we talked about at the beginning, right? Between the amount of time, the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to reproduce the means of subsistence that you need to create your own labor capacity versus the amount of time you can actually work with that labor capacity. And it's that difference, a real difference between the commodity that's sold and the use of the commodity in the actual workday, the use of the labor capacity, that makes surplus value make sense. And that sort of undergirds this whole argument and is part of what we've been saying. So I just want to highlight that that is, I think, Marx is saying, and I personally agree, hopefully you all have come to at least somewhat agree, is what is going on here. And I just want to note, because I think this is something that sometimes comes up in this moment. It's like, well, is he just doing a trick, right? Is he just saying, oh, well, if you use it and you look at it my way, you see that workers are being exploited. And the capitalists are looking at it another way. They see that no one's being exploited. Look, oh, it's just a matter of ideology, of presenting something to you to sort of trick you to see it one way or the other. But that's not actually what's going on here, right? We're trying to understand an economic system that has totally transformed the globe, that has completely shifted all the history of the entire earth. And so we're trying to understand that something that is real, that is not a trick. And we cannot, going back to that either or, right? We cannot base this history on, a falsehood, on someone cheating someone else. The income of people in the United States did not go up 20 times because people cheated well, right? There's something else going on. And so that is what Marx is trying to explain. And I do think he's being consistent there. But all the same, it still seems like we get paid for the work we do, not for the value of our labor power. So what does Marx have to say to this, right? Okay, he's made his argument. Maybe we even agree with him, but the reality is it doesn't feel that way. Well, Marx actually agrees. So to read this longer section, right? The wage form thus erases every trace of the division of the workday into parts where necessary labor and surplus labor, paid and unpaid labor, are performed. All labor appears as paid labor. And then he compares it to the feudal and the slave system, right? So just to sort of bring yourself out of capitalism and see what he's meaning. In the feudal system, in the corvée system, the division between necessary and surplus labor is very clear. There's literally two different farms. You have your personal plot and there's the Lord's plot. On some days, you go to the other plot and you're doing work for someone else. And on some days, you're working on your own plot, which you use to feed yourself and your family, right? And so that is an incredibly clear distinction, both in time and in space, between the necessary and the surplus labor. In the slave system, it's actually sort of counterintuitively the other way of wage labor, right? Where the slave, as a slave, feels like all they're doing is the master's labor. And in a sense, rightfully so, right? They're completely under the direction of the master. They're just doing surplus labor for the master. But, seen a little bit from Marx's terms, we do know that, well, the master is going to feed them, right? There is going to be a bed, however shoddy. There's going to be food, however bad. And that corresponds to some social labor. And so in a sense, some part of the labor the slave is doing is corresponding to their own reproduction, even if it's a small part. But none of it appears that way. It all appears like labor that's stolen from them and that's taken from them because of the form of slavery. And so in comparison to these two sort of other historical forms of taking surplus work from people, with wage labor, it's the other way around. Even surplus labor or unpaid labor appears as paid labor. And I'll just note there's been a number of arguments sort of around what this means, but one of the ones I find interesting, I'm not going to say it's definitively true, is sort of an argument that actually this makes capitalism, in a sense, more stable. There's other forces that are making it unstable. It's constantly transforming the world. But in fact, this sort of ideological veneer makes it more stable than a slave society, which is sort of constantly, in a state of tension and in a state of, things could break and the master could be killed. And, there's a real feeling of tension there. Okay, so just to read the end of the quote here, readers should now be able to see that something of decisive importance occurs when labor power's value or price is transformed into the form of wages, that is, into the value or price of labor itself. On this form of appearance, which renders the true relation invisible, presenting it as the opposite of what it is, rests all the workers' and capitalists' notions of what is fair and just, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all its illusions of freedom, and all the apologetic humbug in vulgar political economy. And so he's basically saying that here at sort of the core, and you could say of a lot of this argument, there's this huge ideological power that capital has over how we experience the life that we live. And to just put that in slightly different terms using some of the diagrams that I've been using here, you could say in a sense there's a whole nother lever here, another abstraction, where there's an apparent price of labor and the value of labor power, which we can see as a class relationship, right? Oh, I'm only getting paid the amount I need to live. It doesn't have to do with how much work I do. They make me do way more work than is actually necessary. That sort of class relationship in which the worker is forced to sell their whole lifetime for a bowl of porridge, quoting from Marx, but I couldn't find the page of that one, i.e. their own means of subsistence. All of that is further obscured by the apparent price of labor. When the capitalist buys labor, it seems, by the hour, right, or by the piece. And so that's sort of what we're going to go into next, is what are these differences between the value of labor power and how it appears either in time wages or in piece wages. Before I jump into that, is there any quick questions? Let's see. Okay. Okay, so I want to just start with time wages. And just basically contrast the appearance and what I'm going to call the underlying essence. So the appearance, right? The worker gets paid per hour. So you're selling hours of labor. Anyone who's worked an hourly job gets this sense, right? The amount of hours you work, that really changes how much money you get. It really seems like you're selling hours. The worker now is responsible for selling enough hours to make the amount of money they need. So even the capitalist doesn't have to employ you for that 12-hour workday. They might just pay you the right hourly amount, and you have to go get 2 or 3 jobs to work the 12-hour day, right? It becomes your responsibility to sell enough hours so that you can become, make ends meet. And then capitalists see this whole system as if they're making shrewd deals. They're paying good dollar for this, wage, and they're getting a good price when they're buying metal from this other company. And that's why they're making money. They don't see the exploitation. It seems like they're buying labor as well. So all of this is hidden, but underneath it, the capitalist is still buying labor power. And the natural hourly wage is equal to the value of labor power divided by the length of the expected workday. And so you have to work enough hours to get your value of your labor power so you can reproduce yourself. And under this system of time wages, each hour is itself divided into necessary and surplus labor. So even if you only work a couple hours in a day for a capitalist, you are still exploited because they're paying you by the hour, and each hour contains that relationship between necessary and surplus. And so just to give an example here, a lot of farm work, right? I'm gonna actually use it for both time and piece wages. So just heads up on that. But this is a strawberry farm, and a lot of the work of planting, doing pesticides, setting up irrigation, this is all work that's paid hourly. The workers come, however long they're working, completing these tasks, they're overseen and watched by a supervisor. They get paid for those hours. That is not how they end up getting paid when actual picking comes due. So there's a shift in the form of pay, but there is room here for time wages and hourly wages. And now to shift a little abruptly, sorry, to piece wages. Here, it's actually very similar to time wages, but slightly shifted, right? So the worker is getting paid per piece. It seems like you're selling pieces to the capitalists, not your labor. And now you as a worker are responsible for working long enough and with enough intensity to make the amount of money that you need. So you have to get enough pieces to make your daily wage. And thus the worker, in a sense, acts as their own supervisor under a piece wage system. And so in terms of the essence, it's still, as always, the capitalist buying labor power. The piece rate, when you think about it, is basically equal to the value of labor power divided by the average number of pieces that are produced in a normal workday. And under these piece wages, the value added to each product contains some necessary and some surplus labor. So each piece that is sold has exploitation in it. You don't have to actually work the full workday. And so when the strawberry farm comes to the time where you actually have to pick the strawberries, the wages shift to piece wages. And I did a little bit of looking. I wouldn't say this is totally precise, but the rate is about, for one of these flat boxes, which I think has 12 of those green strawberry boxes in it, $2.20 per. So just frame that, right? You can see that what you're getting paid for is not the piece. It's not the strawberries. If you went to the shop and tried to buy that many strawberries at Berkeley Bowl or anywhere, it's going to be $30, $50. They're getting paid $2.20 because they're being paid for the labor through the piece. But because of that, the intensity becomes something that the workers sort of have to self-regulate because they have to produce enough flats to make the amount of money. And I'm now going to shift to a short clip from a movie.
Lu! Bisogna rifare I tempi di lavorazione.
Pronti? Pronti. Bisogna controllare I cotimi. Capo, io mi fumo la sigaretta.
Fai vedere?
Rendimento assai scarso. Permetti?
14.
35.
12.
28.
12.
30.
8.
27.
12.
27.
12.
30.
10.
32.
10.
30. Vuoi una sigaretta? Ma rendi di più, no?
La produzione di questa macchina deve aumentare da 115 a 300 pezzi all'ora, capito? Andiamo alla Sigme, dai.
And so basically this guy is the tool worker, the friend of the boss. He's named Lulu. And the boss is coming over and taking him. They have to check the piecework rates. So they bring him over to a different machine and they time him. So they're reading out these numbers. They're timing the various different actions and how long each one takes. And these are sort of, you could say, right, the Taylorist wage time study people that have been hired, are part of the factory and are going around and studying how fast we can push the workers to work. So now in order for this poor guy to make enough money to live, he's going to have to basically double his production because they've shown that that's what could be done on this machine, right? So I just want to frame the piecework, and Marx mentions this, right? But at first, it almost seems, right? Like, you could think of it one way. Oh, well, if I work harder, I can make more money. Great. But that's not actually how it works, right? It's actually still a combat between the worker and the capitalist in which the harder the worker works, the more the capitalist can lower the piece rate because he knows everyone could still make the bare minimum. The piece rate ultimately is still about paying for labor power. It's about paying for the capacity, not about paying for the pieces themselves. And so I just wanted to sort of go through that as an example. And then I'll just encourage everyone to think about various different types of wage work that they do and the different forms it appears. But to go through a couple, some of them I think hopefully are a little interesting to people. But one of the jobs I've had in my life is as a data labeler, very similar to this actually for a SF tech company, where basically, it looks like this. It's a room full of people sitting at computers, and you get something that looks like this computer screen. It's like a 3D point cloud that looks insane. And you go around and you circle all the points that are part of a bus or part of a car or part of a person. You say, that's a person. And then they give you a new 3D point cloud of a different street intersection, and you do the same. And I like this example because it helps you think through some of these dynamics, but you'd think, right, just first look, this is a great opportunity for piece rates. They're just doing the same thing again and again and again. Why don't you pay them per? But it wasn't paid that way. It was paid hourly. And when you think about it a little deeper, you see the obvious reason. Because there isn't a perfectly labeled street corner, right? There's no person who can look at that just like they look at the flat of strawberries and say, oh, you're done and your job is adequate. So they have to sort of give you the time to make sure you actually do it correctly. Otherwise, they could be paying you to make bogus data again and again and again. So because of the character of what you're producing, it's actually difficult for capital to bring in a piece rate here. And they end up sticking with time rates, even though, as sort of Marx said, and a little bit as that clip shows, where capital can, it tries to generally put in piece rates because it absolves it of having to supervise the work. It makes the worker sort of internalize their own supervision. And so another sort of, you could say, classic case of piece rate is being an Uber driver today, right? You're getting paid per ride. The only little complicating factor is that they're also using the piece rate to bring all the workers out on the Saturday evening and the Friday evening and pay them almost nothing on, Wednesday midday. So they're using the piece rate both to pay per ride, but also to sort of actually direct the workers to work times when, I'll just say, I personally, right, would not want to work Friday night. We all want to be at Capital Lecture. We don't want to be out driving Uber. Okay, so, and I'll just note too, Marx doesn't mention it, right? But obviously the salary form of labor is also a form that's pretty common today in the US and I think in many places, including a lot of people who are clearly working class, like teachers. And I don't know if anyone else talked about it. We talked about it a bit in our group, but the salary form has similar types of dynamic, right? Where, the end and the beginning of the workday no longer seem to matter as much. You have a responsibility to these children who are depending on you. You might have to work 10 hours, 12 hours. You might have to devote your whole heart and soul into the job because of how you're paid for it. And so there's all these different ways of paying that sort of fit the labor process and are brought in and out depending on the type of work you're doing. And I just sort of want to highlight that. And then say as a last note, I'll just admit here, I don't know if anyone else has this feeling. I personally had this feeling at this point in the book. Excuse me, I think that one of the times I read it, but that, okay, aren't we on a little bit of a shaky ground here? So we've said that we're selling the value, labor power for its value, but now we're selling the price of labor, which is loosely tied to labor power, which is itself loosely tied to the means of subsistence, which are the only thing that actually has a value. Isn't there something, it doesn't seem very solid. It doesn't seem like we're standing on super solid ground. Well, I'll just note, I'll say it here, the value of labor power does not fully explain the wages we get paid. It does give a general idea, but why are wages constantly pushed down until they only cover the necessary means of subsistence? I actually think that is an open question at this point, and it's something that Marx is going to come in chapter 23 and fit that last piece in, which is the general law of capitalist accumulation, how basically wages are brought down and turned into a commodity. So I just wanted to highlight that that's coming next lecture. I'm not going to get more deep into it now, but it is true that there's a little bit of a tenuous logic here because we're still missing one really important piece. And then finally at the end, just a little bit on reproduction. Simple Reproduction. And this, we're sort of tackling, again, all these different concepts that we've covered so far, but from a new angle. We're zooming way out, and we're looking at, in a sense, the whole world, the whole social system, and we're saying, we do clearly live in this incredibly complex social web with millions of others, capitalism. How does capitalism, like any social organism, reproduce itself? Why does it continue year after year after year? And so that's the question Marx is starting to get in this last section, or second to last section of the book. And he starts with simple reproduction, which for anyone who isn't that far yet, is basically reproduction without accumulating, without growing. And we'll cover that soon. But to quickly just go way back again to one of these earlier lectures and pull out this image. This is, in a sense, an image of capitalism, not going super deep into what's actually going on in Chevron and Johnson & Johnson, but from a sky-high view, this is how capitalism is working, right? We have a bunch of capitalist firms. They are buying labor power from workers. They are buying means of production from the market, and they're selling commodities back to the market. On the other hand, we have a bunch of wage workers who are buying their means of subsistence on the market and selling their labor power. And in that cycle, it actually doesn't just even out. It doesn't become a perfect circle. More and more and more is produced for the rich, whether in the form of their projects, rocket ships, their literal luxury consumption in mansions and super yachts, whether in some form of, defense and power and missiles, or in new factories that they make more money on next year, right? So more and more of the total production is going to the rich. And it's this cycle that's sort of shown in a frozen picture here that we're going to be talking through when we talk about reproduction. Because a society is not frozen, capitalism is not frozen, it's some sort of maniacal social organism that's always moving forward, always changing, always growing, right? And so how is it doing this process of reproduction? And I wanted to give a somewhat complex diagram that hopefully helps about just sort of what is going on year to year. Because part of what Marx is saying with reproduction is just that when you look at the whole social product, you have to produce the things in this year that you need in the next year. And then you see what the results are. What do you have in the next year that you have, produced? So to just take this example with hypothetical dollar amounts, let's say in year one, your society, you have $20 million in various raw materials, depreciation of machines that's used up in production. You're also paying $10 million in wages to workers, which just covers their means of subsistence. And then there's an extra 10 million of new surplus value that's produced, whether as rent, as profit, as interest on investments, et cetera. And that makes up, right, the total yearly product. All the things you produce in a year are that 40 million, which is then sold on the market. And one part of it, I have the arrow going back up, but that's mostly just to indicate, right, that it's sort of a wasteful consumption. The surplus value in simple reproduction is not going to expand, it's not going to make new things. It's going to be consumed as luxury, basically, by the rich. It's those mansions, it's those yachts, it's all these things that are produced that they're consuming. But then the 20 million in various raw materials, tools, and machines that was used up needs to be replaced, just to give it a little image. And the 10 million of means of subsistence are completely used up. They were paid just as much as they need to work. So that also needs to be replaced. And finally, each year, there's a new 10 million of surplus value that the capitalists can wastefully consume. And so this cycle can continue year after year, right? Reproducing the raw materials in the machines, reproducing the means of subsistence, and constantly producing surplus value for capital. So you could live in this simple reproduction world as a capitalist, and money just seems to rain down on you year on year. On the other hand, for the workers, right, you're only paid your means of subsistence. So you're living paycheck to paycheck. And what does that mean, right? It means that if, let's say, you get paid for a week, then you work for that week, you buy the things you need for that week. At the end of that week, you need to go get paid again. You need to sell yourself again. We're actually right back at where we started. no fundamental transformation in your conditions has happened. Your conditions have been reproduced. You're only paid enough to make it to the next paycheck, right? That is the condition of sort of being paycheck to paycheck. Obviously, there's a little bit of complication there once you take into account, I don't know, retirement and all these other things that are really lifelong things. But in a sense, this is the condition of a vast number of people, even in America, you know, to quote Bernie and Zoran of late, the richest country in the history of the world, et cetera. And so fundamentally, the dispossession that makes the workers sell their labor power, their labor capacity as a commodity is always reproduced because they're only paid enough to reproduce themselves until they're ready to sell it again. They're not accumulating. They're not, making enough to suddenly become an investment capitalist and buy a $10 million stake in OpenAI and then be rich for the rest of your lives or whatever. And so this is, part, you could say, of social reproduction, is that not only the capitalists keep getting the money falling down from the sky, but the workers are put again and again in this same condition of dispossession. And so taking this zoomed out view, this social perspective of reproduction of capitalism, what do we end up seeing? Well, even though at the beginning, right, we started this whole section, or earlier I said, it's not just a cheating that's happening at the core of capitalism. Something else is going on. There's actually the sale of labor power for its right value, and then there's the actual use of labor power in the workday. Well, when we zoom far enough out, we do see that capital is above, and the working class are basically a captive army, right? Maybe you're working for a different capitalist this day or the next. Maybe, whatever else has changed. But ultimately, you are dispossessed. You need to find someone to sell yourself to, or you're going to have a hard time. And that is the general condition, and that's the reproduced condition of society. And so even if you're not chained to a particular master, you are chained by the economic forces to capital. And you must always sort of feed it with your surplus value. And so that is the sort of overall picture that you do still end up getting with this analysis. And I do want to note, just because it fits some of my own previous sort of ways of thinking through this, but he does come in and say that variable capital, which I'm glad I already defined, so thank you for that, but right, the amount of capital that's paid to the workers as their wages is nothing but a particular historical form of appearance of the fund for the means of subsistence, or the labor fund, that the worker needs in order to maintain and reproduce himself, and that he has to keep producing and reproducing in every system of social production. The labor fund constantly flows to the worker in the form of means of payment for his labor, only because his own product constantly moves away from him in the form of capital, right? So Marx is just noting that, in a sense, what we're getting paid, all of us in our wages, is just the fund that's going to reproduce the working class. And in a sense, in any society, if we want to go back to this sort of analogy we've used, people need to work, and the people who are working need to reproduce. There's always a fund for providing the necessaries of life to the social body, to the people who are working and producing those same things. And so that is, to use this sort of frame I've been using, right? That's a basic truth about human life, applies to all human social life, always and in all places. But in capitalism, this has become a specific fund that's always limited just to those, in a sense, basic necessities. Yes, it's maybe a little bigger, a little smaller here and there. And it is formed as variable capital, as part of the very process of capital accumulating itself, always on the condition that it also provides surplus value. And so again, right, this is a specific way that capitalism has reshaped something that, in a sense, we always need as human beings. And with that, I am actually at the end. So I'm happy to take any questions. And next lecture, we'll be going through the general law, accumulation, the general law of capitalist accumulation. And then we'll also be going through so-called primitive accumulation or original accumulation. So it's going to be, I would say, a very spicy time, because both of those are really key elements of the whole book. Okay, any questions or thoughts?
Yeah. So I've had this question as I've been reading about the means of subsistence, and I understand that it's sort of the things that a worker needs to be able to go into work the next day, basically. And I have been, on the one hand, it's sort of the material stuff, the food, the housing, whatever. But I also wonder if this would also encompass something like education or the skills that they need to develop to then perform a specific type of work. Um, I don't know if that would be sort of included in Marx's understanding of like what society needs for the means of subsistence.
Yes, I think it certainly would, and I'm realizing in that picture where I had all the different commodities, there's nothing like that. But it is true that, right, to the extent that labor needs to be trained up, that literal work, in a sense of building your neighbor, is also included in the value of labor power, because it's part of the work that goes into reproducing labor power, labor capacity with the needed skills and capabilities of the modern world, which include all sorts of things like reading, writing, things that, you go back 300 years in history and only 4% of people, or 3% or 2% even, knew how to do. So, sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Cool.
Another means of subsistence question. So the arc here is kind of projecting that the means of subsistence the value will keep going down. So the industrial capitalist can make more money. But we seem to be in a period where the means of subsistence, the price is going up, like in particular rent, housing. So I know this is probably not, the answer to this is probably not in volume one, but that it really seems like we're in this crisis. The industrial capitalist is really in crisis, in part because the means of subsistence is not getting cheaper.
Yeah. I think one, that's right. But two, and you probably know this, but so, technically at this point, we haven't even really gotten to rent yet. And so rent, ultimately, most of it is considered part of profit and part of surplus labor. And so I think that is how Marx would think of it, that we're paying a bunch of money to people who are speculating on land values as sort of a form of seizing surplus labor from society. But it's gotten to the point, I think you're right, where there's actually a real conflict in some sense between these people who are seizing surplus value through rent and the industrial capitalists that are trying to seize surplus value through extra time. And there is a real conflict there. And I'll just note personally, I think it always is important to recognize real conflicts, because we're only going to win when we separate our enemies and disorganize them and organize ourselves as well. We're not going to be able to win if we instead turn them into an even stronger enemy. So yes, I think there's a real conflict of interest between, in a sense, these two classes, the landlords and the capitalists. Not that means that either one is less our own enemy, but and that is something that comes up a little bit in volume 3, which but yes, and then I guess the only slight clarification is that I think strictly speaking, when we pay a lot more in rent, that is not actually an increase in the necessary labor as we are here. That's just a different way surplus value is being pulled from society. But to the industrial capitalist, it sure does seem like an increase in the necessary wage. Is that getting at what you were? Okay. Any other questions?
Probably more comments than questions, but just in my reading of Marx, I find him just very flexible and understanding that what is defined as the means of subsistence is very much socially defined. So an education, as an example, what is expected of someone, what they need for an education to do a certain job. And I'm just thinking the beginning of your whole lecture tonight, starting with did you call it a joke? Of talking about what we think of as productive and educators not being considered in that productive. And I, as an early care educator or an organizer of early care educators, struggle constantly with talking about what is needed for an early care, the educational support, the development of an early care educator. And when we make any kind of caregiving just not important, when we see it as not important, you don't think of it as needing sort of deep psychology and philosophical background. And we don't give those kind of workers the kind of need where if we could move into a social structure that really valued caring about humans, those people might be seen as needing the most depth and deepest education. But we look at tech workers and the STEM is elevated rather than the caregiving, and that's happening more and more intensively all the time. So just thinking about what a person who works in different fields needs to develop is really socially defined and not very well defined. I had another thought with this comment too, but I'll let someone else have the mic.
Just a quick thought on what Mike was asking about. Without rent control, landlords actually love minimum wage increases.
So I guess you mentioning the fact that STEM careers are kind of seen with this like respect and admiration, it's so much deeper than most fields or whatever. It's just interesting because it's STEM, technological advancement under capitalism essentially is reducing it's reducing the amounts of necessary labor to actually be performed, thus increasing surplus value. And under a socialist kind of system that you showed earlier, surplus value just becomes our free time, becomes time that we actually claw back for ourselves. And so it's, I don't know. It was just interesting. Sorry.
Yeah. Maybe these two things could actually be in alignment in a different world. Someone's giving free time and some people are using free time to actually care for each other and build different way of living. Or I think it is important also just to recognize that we could be living in a very different world, given that we live in the richest country in the world at the richest time in the history of the world. Anyway, I just wanted to say one more thing, which is I agree with you that it sounds like less of a joke when you put it that way. Yeah, and absolutely. And just to add, maybe, I don't know, hopefully it's helpful, but when you do see those sorts of jobs taken over by capital, right? Because you do see now nursing homes that are run in a capitalist fashion and schools that are run in a capitalist fashion, it's not necessarily these things that you're talking about that end up getting emphasized. So, I don't know. This is just a personal anecdote of like a doctor I know who, they try to get her to do 15 minutes per patient, the way it's thought of, because it's thinking about productivity as making money for others, is still not the way you're thinking about it, even when it is technically in the productive sector for all these reasons. So, I just completely agree. Good.
I'm sorry, like my brain's a little fried from the end of the week. But I guess what's interesting when you brought up the fact that, we're forced to do more gig work in order to actually provide for the necessary labor that, to replenish that's not being done by one job, it's being done by several jobs. And now, like, we're getting squeezed on the other end with automation. You have robo taxis, you have Waymo, you have all these things that are essentially taking what was once liberating freelance work. Oh, you're your own boss, you drive around, you do all this, you do all that, and then kicking you to the curb, getting you on that end too, using technology to further extract surplus value.
Yeah. And I'll just say, that is, well, I don't know. Hopefully this is a helpful thought for everyone who's going into this, but I would say chapter 23 in the general law is about bringing in precisely this, and mechanization and technology and the competition between worker and capital, which comes about in technology, into this question of the labor market and social reproduction and accumulation, and saying, oh, when we put these two pieces together, we see why, you know, capitalists will use technology to always push wages down and to enforce the value of labor power being somewhat close to the means of subsistence. So that is a little preview, but yes, those are the key pieces that when you put them together, you get that, I don't know, that last sort of key piece that makes you see something crazy. And then of course we go to original accumulation, which is the dark history of the whole thing. So, okay. Any last questions? But it is getting close to 8. I said we would definitely end by 8, Tamale. So
it just is more of an observation of how even Trump at some point said, China plans 5 and 10 years ahead of time. He says, and we all just look at the next quarter. And I think that's how I feel about this society right now, is that there's really, I mean, except for maybe building the concentration camps out in, Arizona and stuff, looking ahead. I just see the society as in free fall, so to speak. There is no plan. There doesn't seem to be any sense of a structural future of, I mean, the reports that possibly AI may throw, 65 to 100 million people out of work, as it automates very complex programming and other tasks. There seems to be in this society absolutely no thought of what it is going to be like in 5 years or 10 years. And that is the interesting thing, is that's exactly Marx's point. He says, once you get into the capital world, you move beyond commodity exchange and money into capital. He said there are no guardrails. There's only growth, and there's absolutely no other consideration. And that's what I feel. And I try to talk to people all the time about their values, and people are they're so poorly educated, and they're so uncurious, and they have such weird, confused, cockamamie, contradictory ideas that I don't know. It seems to me to be really that we're on the edge of something pretty dramatic that we have absolutely no picture of. And it's capitalism.
Yeah. Thanks for that, John. I think we should call it. But yes, I agree. I mean, to say what you were saying, a couple of things, right? Capital is producing for exchange value, not for use value. So there's only one value, exchange value. And the sort of definition of capitalism, in a sense, right, is, I think we covered this in maybe 1 or 2 lectures ago, but it has this weird reversal where the factory itself is so disciplined, it's so controlled, it's so transformed and constantly transforming. But society at large is an anarchic mess, which seems planless and in fact is guided by these underlying laws that no one has a full grip on. And that is, I think, one of the, defining reversals of capitalism, where in earlier systems of production, generally all of society was pretty planned, often by a king or, someone who shouldn't be doing it, but was pretty planned. Whereas the daily work that people were doing was largely left up to them. Okay. With that, we should call it because it's 8 and I think people need to load, but thank you all for coming and spending a part of your Friday night here. And please have some pizza.